but I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Brody's webinar, which is entitled Scotland's Food, the Sustainability Challenge. This is part of our Brody's series of enlightened thinking events on climate and sustainability issues. So just to introduce myself, my name is Clive Phillips. I head the rural business team at Brody's. So by way of introduction to what we're going to discuss today, we're all now very much aware of the huge climate challenge in front of us as individuals, as businesses, and as a human race, both in terms of climate and biodiversity loss. Human beings require to refuel every day, most of us 3 times a day, and as we go into the festive season, some of us many more times than that. Our very survival depends on the food chains that supply that food and the sustainability of those supplies. Climate change and biodiversity loss is challenging us to rethink our relationship to food, our production methods, and its impact on the environment around us. Today, we're going to hear from 3 forward-thinking speakers from different parts of that debate as to how we face up to those challenges. We'll hear about the role of reducing food waste, about the use of technology to introduce new growing systems, and how we adapt traditional livestock systems to meet those challenges. So I'd like to just introduce you to our 3 speakers. We have Dr. William Clark from Zero Waste Scotland. He is a cell biologist working as a bioeconomy policy analyst. He's a passionate advocate of reducing the climate impact and resource intensity of the human food supply chain. William is confident that the transition towards more circular food systems is key to achieving climate neutrality objectives, and we'll hear how he sees that being achieved. We also have Professor Derek Stewart from the James Hutton Institute. Professor Stewart leads at the James Hutton Institute on 3 innovative UK vertical farming projects, which will explore the innovative use of precision-controlled environment technologies. These projects are aimed at delivering increased commercial, economic, and environmental benefits to agriculture, food and drink sectors in the UK and internationally. So we'll hear about how new tech is driving new food production systems. Then we'll also hear from Kate Rowell, Chair of Quality Meat Scotland. Kate is a 5th generation sheep and suckler cow farmer from near Peebles in the Scottish borders. Kate trained and practiced as a vet and has been a member of the board of Quality Meat Scotland for 5 years and has been the chair since October 2018. She was chosen as an emerging leader by the Oxford Farming Conference in 2018. And she's going to talk to us about adapting traditional livestock systems to some of the challenges ahead. So I'd like to introduce you and hand you over, first of all, to Dr. William Clark of Zero Waste Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive, and just a quick thanks to the team at Brody's as well for the opportunity to speak to you all today. So, as mentioned, my name is William Clark. I'm a bioeconomy policy analyst with Zero Waste Scotland, and I'm here today to talk to you about the future of food. Slide, please. So we're very limited for time today, and I would ask you all to visit our website for a wider view on the work that we do as Zero Waste. But as a summary, we exist to advance resource efficiency and the circular economy within Scotland, focusing on where we can have the greatest impact on climate change. So please visit our website, but slide, please. So it's fallen to me today to really frame the problem for you. And this is work that's been ongoing for about a year now within Zero Waste, but there is a wider programme around about it. So the protein gap. As the population approaches 9 billion in 2050, under business as usual, we will need to find a way to supply another 60 to 100 million tonnes of additional protein to ensure food security. And most of that growth, as you can see, will be focused through the developing world, and we'll come back to that in a second. Slide, please. Now, we mentioned we need to increase protein production. So the land gap, this graph shows global land allocation for food production in million kilometres squared. And the bit I want to highlight for you is that the habitable land surface of the world, 51% of that is already covered by agriculture. So to further expand, we're really looking at novel systems, forests, savannas, and other areas that aren't currently under livestock. A large part of that agricultural land is taken up by livestock, and by that I mean that it's used to both feed and house the livestock as well. Slide, please. So the emissions gap, and this is where it starts to get complicated. So food systems already account for 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So for us to increase to meet that demand for 60 to 100 million tonnes of protein, we will have to increase that associated global greenhouse gas emissions with agriculture. The panel on the right shows per capita animal protein consumption versus GDP. So as countries industrialise, they get richer, they become more settled, they tend towards a higher meat diet. And looking to the left, you'll see that livestock, including fish farms and land use as well, is quite a high proportion of food systems, and that is also going to increase as this per capita demand increases as well. Now that's a negative bit, but on the positive side, livestock's a major industry for Scotland, and what an opportunity to miss going forward if we can't capitalise on that kind of growth. Slide, please. Now at the same time, and this irks me terribly, so food waste. As a global community, we waste 1.3 billion tonnes of food in a world with more than 80 million hungry people in it. That's more than 1/3 of the food produced. It's an area larger than China in terms of emissions. As that food waste decomposes, it produces enough greenhouse gases to become the 3rd biggest country in the world. And looking to the economic value, that's a £750 billion loss. Slide, please. So just to take a second to recognise that farmers aren't the bad guys and livestock certainly aren't the bad guys. The carbon footprint of Scottish livestock production declined by 15% between 1999 and 2017, and is already well below the world average carbon footprint of beef. Slide, please. However, this shows a snapshot of where we are just now. The agricultural emissions within Scotland are the 2nd largest emissions by sector. And the issue there is, as other industries decarbonise, they tend to look to bioresource to do so. So everybody's looking to agriculture to produce production to meet their demands for biomass. So, the onus is really on agriculture to solve this issue. At the same time, Scotland is the 3rd largest agricultural emissions as a proportion of total across the EU. I just want to take a second to highlight that, sustainability conversations go well beyond carbon. This is not a reason not to buy Scottish produce, but Kate will talk to you about that in a second. At the same time, I also want to highlight there is a question around how much of the reduction that is required the industry can deliver under the technologies that we have at the moment. Slide, please. So the bottom line is, globally, we need to meet greater protein demand using less land and producing fewer emissions while answering the food waste question if it's at all possible. Slide, please. So other countries around the world have taken a slightly different approach to solving these problems. They recognise that ecological, environmental and economic benefits, co-benefits can be realised, but it needs a different way of thinking about the system. So the governments shown across the top there have published protein strategies, and we have done an in-depth document, which the link is at the bottom if you want more information. But while each protein plan is unique to its region, the report identifies 7 common features. So each of them looks to extensive stakeholder engagement and collaboration. It's innovation for uptake. Each of them seeks to reduce the environmental impacts of their feed and food supply chains, and that's domestic and and non-territorial at the same time. Each of them seeks to increase domestic protein production. There's a huge opportunity around this. We'll come to that in a second, but it's also to reduce dependence on imported soy and the associated negative impacts. We all saw the story in The Guardian last week. This is the critical bit for me. Each of them seeks to integrate circular economy principles and platforms to optimize biomass and resources. They all look to accelerate innovation and sustainable product development. They all look to put money in place to mobilize public and private finance to make this happen. And the key thing for me is they all look to legislative and policy reform using an evidence-led approach. But the legislation is all based on a linear economy. Now we're moving to a circular economy. There are some aspects of that are going to need to be addressed as we go forward to enable the transition. Slide, please. So looking at some of the mechanisms, the platforms that they're using within them, and this is legumes. So as you know, we all know plants fix carbon, but legumes have an additional advantage in that they can also fix nitrogen. So they're taking 2 major greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and putting it back in the soils. The top corner there shows you peas and beans. We can't grow soy in Scotland, but we are good at peas and beans. That can be for animals, but also thinking about humans. 27,000 new sustainable food products entered the market. I would argue this applies to all the platforms we're talking about today, but it's a huge growth market. It's 10% CAGR, and it's a nutritional, complete protein. At the same time, there are other plants that we can look to in Scotland, such as vetches and lupins, but we need R&I programs around about that to maximise the opportunities. Clover, it's an obvious inclusion in the feeds, but at the same time, grass refining offers an opportunity to optimise that material for cattle, so you can increase the area of your farm virtually, but at the same time reduce the enteric fermentation. So sustainable livestock is entirely possible, and by moving to a slightly different model, we're starting to look at agroecology. You look after the small things, and the big things will come along. So by looking after the soils, the insects, the birds, and everything else in terms of biodiversity comes along as well. Slide, please. So insect farming, it sounds a bit weird, but it's a new type of livestock. Imagine your cows could eat double their body weight every day and grow to 10,000 times their size in 2 weeks. This is what we're looking at with insect farming. It's happening all over the world. We're trying to import this as an idea into the UK, but you can take massive volumes of food waste and produce biodiesel, produce a protein which you can feed the fish at the moment. It's going to be extended to poultry in the new year, but you can also make an excellent biofertilizer. We spend £38 million in Scotland on fertilizers every year. And the circular economy does offer some answers. Slide, please. So fungi, I'm going to whip through these. We're running out of time a wee bit, but everybody's familiar with the products of fungi, including mushrooms, but also looking to wines and cheeses after we've got here. But when you look at that in the context of biotechnology, you're looking at edible fungi, biocontrol, bioremediation, biomass degradation, so you can take forestry waste and food waste and produce new protein through this system, or other products. You're looking at pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, textiles, all sorts of stuff. On the bottom left there, though, I want to show you that these can also replace plastic. So this is an entire set of headphones which were grown in Finland using microbes and fungi, spider silk and a couple other materials. So they're entirely durable, but it is about food, it is about sustainable food, but there's a huge amount of opportunities coming through that at the same time. Slide, please. Microalgae, we can capture carbon dioxide and methane and other gases and turn them into biomass, pharmaceuticals and everything else. Slide, please. I'm very sorry, I'm running out of time. The thing I wanted to highlight, though, is that these are nature-based solutions. My job is in the bioeconomy, but I take my inspiration from nature. The question for me is not whether change is happening, it is. The question is, how can we work together to support and accelerate this work, leverage the activities so that the economic and environmental benefits are greater than the sum of the parts. Slide, please.
So to live sustainably, we have to eat, and no disparaging comments to all, but there's more to life than just protein. There's other things we have to eat, but we have to be able to produce them sustainably. So something I've been working on for a while now is controlled environment agriculture, within which vertical farming sits. So why do we bother changing how we grow things? Well, I think, next slide, please. As William has identified, we're looking at some problems. Population's on an increase, 8.3 billion by 2030, or 9.2 by 2050. They all have to be fed, which means we're looking at a 50% food increase. People need to drink, and we need to grow the crops, so there's an increase in demand for water. If you're growing crops or livestock, you need the land on which they need to grow, so there's a huge amount of that needs to be used. And all of that needs energy. And at the same time, because of our not necessarily ideal systems, we've been trashing the soils, so we're looking at problems. Next slide, please. So just to add the icing on the cake of that, we've got climate change happening as well. So as the population's increasing, we think by the end of that, about 12 to 40% of the Earth's land surface will be developing novel climates. And here we see just an incidence of flooding in, I think this is actually South America, not Africa. And it shows you the problems that they'll encounter. But anyone that will remember 2012 will remember, or 2015, the huge flooding problems. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus in on horticulture and the term horticulture 4.0. We've seen an evolution in how we produce many crops. So the 4.0 means we're in the 4th generation now of horticulture. And this is a term commonly used in smart manufacturing. So we started off with some pretty ornate and nice looking glass houses, the bottom left here, where we were really dependent on, this is the advent of steam power. So it was huge fossil fuel driven systems, steam for glass houses. Then we shifted into a more production post-war based things. And then essentially in the 90s, we started to get computers and automation coming into glasshouse production. But what we're seeing now is the link of things into the Internet of Things. So actually embedding sensors and internet related systems so you can control them from wherever. Next slide, please. So to give you a feel for scale, I mean, some of the early glasshouses were enormous, but then if you move to the right and upper, here we see just a common Dutch glasshouse productions site, which is just, it's vast. And directly below it, this is a picture taken flying over some of those at night. So you can see the energy demand on these is enormous. A halfway house between field agriculture and glasshouse, of course, you've got these polytunnels, which if you've driven through Tayside, these proliferate through there. Tayside being the soft fruit centre for Scotland and arguably the UK. And my institute, the Hutton, helped develop these systems such that previously soft fruit production was outside. So now they've reduced their footprint by 75%, but not actually by 300%, but they're more productive than they ever were, and they're producing more fruit than they did previously outside. Next slide, please. So what we're doing here at the James Hutton Institute through Tay City's money, I'm director of this centre, and we're taking all these new technologies and trying to put them together to devise new systems for production that would be where you can completely control the environment, and therefore climate change won't make any impact on it. Next slide, please. And so within that, you see on the left, we've got vertical farming, and the other parts are actually developing just next generation controlled environment systems. These could be better glasshouses, better polytunnels, and sensor-based systems to assess these. And of course, going along with that is how do you store crops as well? Because we don't eat everything immediately we pick it. And actually, if you go to places like Africa, 40% of their crop is lost because they've got poor harvest situations. So we need to think about this in a global environment, because food's a globally traded commodity. Next slide, please. So I'll focus in on vertical farming. So I do a lot of work, and my group does a lot of work with different vertical farming companies, and there are many different designs, as you can imagine. So these are two here. You've got Vertical Futures on the left, and this is their concept design that's getting built at the moment. As you can see, it's a sort of tower-based system. And on the right here, you've got a containerized one from Liberty Produce, whose demonstrator is here in Dundee on our site. So if there are a group of people who are keen to come and see it, we can arrange that. Next slide, please. And then there's the one, this one's Intelligent Growth Solutions. You might be more familiar with them from the press. Theirs is very much a tower-based system where they've got multiple trays that are all on a mechanized system that can then come round. And in fact, the guy who designed the mechanized system designed the mechanics within the Amazon tower systems you would see, for example, in the Dunfermline warehouse. So all these systems are all very highly designed from an energy efficiency basis internally. Now if we take a look at to see what they're like growing crops, there's an interesting figure there, and we've done some calculations that certainly for the IGS system, 2 of the towers, which is 60 trays, and the trays are about 1.5 by 3 meters, 2 of those towers would give you about 100 meters squared footprint. Now on a production basis, that's equivalent to a hectare of land. So its productivity is massive, because that means, the reason for this is because you're controlling the environment and you can grow crops 24/7, 365. You can run it completely. What we've also found from looking at a lot of these vertical farming systems, the ones that are well energy managed and have got closed loop systems, their emissions are almost zero because they're using so little input. The Their use of water is down by about 90% compared to comparative outside or glasshouse use. And their use of expensive and fossil fuel-based fertilizers is a lot lower compared to glasshouses and so on, because they're managing and monitoring this all the time. Next slide, please. So the key part to a lot of these vertical farming situations, technologies, and also polytunnels and glasshouses is energy. Energy is the key killing point for these. If you don't manage the energy, you will absolutely lose money. So what we're working on now with a lot of them is look to see how they obtain this energy. Now it could be if you have your own wind turbine and it's not all going to grid, you've got free energy you can put in. Obviously, what you're comparing against is field-grown crops or to a degree glasshouse crops where you're using sunlight. But there's some innovative systems we're looking at now where, as I say, you've got the turbine systems if you're next to hydro, or we're working with the coal authority now to look to put cold water down coal mines, and then as it comes back up, it's significantly hotter by about 30, 40 degrees. So you use heat exchangers then, and that can then fuel a large proportion of your energy requirements. Also, the vertical farming systems, because it's got plants, they don't need light all the time. So if you have a grid connection, it means you can pool energy from the grid when there's too much and it's cheap. In actual fact, and when the grid needs you to stop drawing energy, if you can switch off very fast, which is called demand side response, if you can do that fast, the energy companies will pay you to stop drawing power and take it when it's cheap as well. So as you see, growing food is not just a simplistic system, and it needs a whole system approach. But there's huge opportunity for Scotland given its huge level of renewable energy. So hopefully that's given you a flavour. I'll look forward to some of your questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's me now. Thanks very much for having me speak here today. Today I'm here representing QMS, which stands for Quality Meat Scotland, and we are the Red Meat Levy Board in Scotland, and our mission is to develop, support, promote and protect the red meat industry. So first slide, please. So just a quick definition of sustainability. This is out the dictionary, and it is the ability to be maintained at a certain level, as well as the avoidance of the depletion of natural resources. Next slide. And I know the first thing that most of us think about when we talk about sustainability is the environmental sustainability. But there are different types of sustainability, and they all sort of apply to the farming sector in Scotland. For example, to have human sustainability, we all need a good work-life balance. We need to look after our health and our mental health. We need to be sure that our businesses have a succession plan in place and we're not just going to work until we drop. And we do need education and skills to be passed down from generation to generation. For social sustainability, rural communities require a turnover of people. They need young people to stay and to come to the areas so that we can avoid depopulation and stagnation. And new blood does bring new ideas and enthusiasm. Green spaces are vital for health and well-being, as most of us have rediscovered over the past 8 or 9 months. And so we need to make sure that everybody has access to them and they in themselves are sustainable and get spoiled. Local businesses obviously need people to survive, and they may become unprofitable and unsustainable if populations in rural areas decrease. And things like flood prevention are really becoming more important as we go through climate change. And obviously, sometimes natural solutions can be much more sustainable than other ways. So that's another way we can look at social sustainability. And then we come to economic sustainability. And obviously, businesses all have to be profitable, or else they're not going to be sustainable in the long term. They need to be able to invest and reinvest in the future. And this applies to all parts of the supply chain, to farmers, auction markets, processors, village shops. Everybody needs to be able to make some money from their business for it to survive. COVID has put a huge strain on supply chains, and there's probably going to be more to come with Brexit. So we need to look at if they are sustainable, or would they be better if they were more local and shorter? In that case, would we need more local infrastructure, for example, small abattoirs around about the country? And are current levels of our self-sufficiency in this country adequate? or do we need to look at becoming more sustainable in our food security? And then there's the argument about offshoring. Do we really feel comfortable offshoring jobs, emissions, food and animal welfare standards? And is that sustainable in the long term? So next slide, please. So obviously the one that springs to mind first is the environmental sustainability. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And it probably is what most people think about first. So next slide. So first of all, greenhouse gases. As William said, Scottish beef emissions are low. They're at about half the global average, actually. 20 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram here, compared to 46 as a global average. And this is estimated by the UN. Next slide, please. And in the grand scheme of things, livestock farming is quite a small percentage of our total emissions, but it still is obviously really important to work at decreasing it as much as possible. And we can do that by becoming more efficient. So some of the things that farmers in Scotland are looking at the moment are, and actually practicing at the moment, are improving their grassland management, nutrient budgeting, which includes things like planting legumes, like William's talking about, to decrease the use of artificial fertiliser, improving the storage and application of manure and slurry, looking at animal genetics to see what we can improve there. For example, individual cows have very, very different levels of methane production. Some are 50% of others. If we can get that linked to genetics and use that going forward, then we can vastly decrease the amount of methane that is produced by cattle. We're also looking at diet supplements to decrease methane. Things like seaweed, which are natural solutions, have been shown to work really well in this. And these trials are all going on at the minute. And also, if we can improve the health of all our animals, this will give us more output from the same number of animals. So the use of fossil fuels is obviously our biggest problem. We need to decarbonise heat and transport, and we're all going to have to make huge changes. But obviously food is part of that. Next slide, please. So biodiversity crisis has really come up the agenda recently, and it's hugely important. So studies have shown that mixed cattle and sheep grazing of upland pasture does support more biodiversity than single species grazing, or indeed no grazing at all. And we've got to remember that 80% of Scotland's agricultural land is rough grazing or permanent pasture. And so that's not suitable for growing cereals or vegetables. Only ruminant livestock can turn this grass into a protein that we can eat. So it's almost our duty to make the most of that if we can. Nearly half of the agricultural area in Scotland is used for high nature value farming, which supports a huge range of habitats and species of high importance, including many butterflies and birds. And over 1 million hectares of this is in agri-environmental schemes at the moment. Next slide, please. So we also discussed, the other two speakers also discussed water, and obviously in Scotland, we don't have any problem with the amount of rainfall we have. But climate change may mean that water becomes much more scarce in other areas. So really, we should be making the most of the good conditions we've got here with regards to water. And we must remember that a typical beef and sheep system uses 94% of the water it uses is green water. So that's basically rainfall. It's not taking it from any other areas. Next slide, please. So soils are one of our biggest assets in Scotland, and the soils here are some of the most carbon rich in the world and hold more than 3,000 megatons of carbon. And that figure hasn't changed for 40 years, so it's not been getting worse. Grazing animals contribute to soil organic matter, and this can also increase carbon storage. And studies have shown that older grassland stores more carbon. So all that 80%, which is grazing or rough grazing or permanent pasture, is a huge carbon sink. And we've got to remember that if we were to start trying to plough this up to grow cereals or vegetables, it would release a large amount of carbon back into the atmosphere. And this land would require ploughing to do anything like that. You wouldn't be able to use minimum or no till on the sort of land that we have rough grazing and permanent pasture on at the moment. Next slide, please. And also, as mentioned before, the manure that comes from grazing animals is a natural fertiliser. And when they're out in the field, it also supports insects and contributes to the organic matter in the soil and is part of the circular economy as well. Next slide, please. And animal welfare, that's a huge concern for us at QMS. So we have farm assurance schemes which have been running for more than 30 years. We work very closely with the Scottish SPCA to ensure that animal welfare is as high as it could possibly be. And 90% of the cattle and sheep in Scotland are covered by these schemes. They are whole of life, whole of supply chain schemes, which in practice means that every single part of the chain is independently audited to ensure that there are high welfare standards. So if you buy something with a blue Scotch label on it, you can be absolutely guaranteed that it's been born in Scotland, reared in Scotland by farmers who are checked every year. It's then been transported on lorries that have all been checked by our independent auditors. If it's gone through an auction market, they've also been inspected, and the processors are all in Scotland and are all also part of the schemes. So if you buy something with the blue rosette on, you can be guaranteed that the food miles are as low as possible, and so therefore the carbon footprint is as low as possible as well. Next slide, please. So to bring this all together, the farming sector is working really hard to increase the environmental sustainability, but we do need the help of consumers to do this. So by buying local, it means that other factors involved in sustainability, the human, social and economic ones that I spoke about right at the very start, are also being addressed. So you're contributing to local, often fragile rural economies when you're buying local food, and you're helping people stay in rural areas. You're supporting Scottish farmers, you're supporting their profitability, and therefore that leads on to them having better mental and physical health. You're keeping supply chains local, and so reducing food miles and preventing offshoring of jobs and emissions, and supporting local solutions to local problems like flooding, access to green spaces and air pollution. And all of this contributes to everyone's well-being and quality of life, as well as to the well-being quality of life of the whole planet. Next slide, please. So I'm obviously here to talk about red meat, but if you substitute local for Scotch here, it applies to our whole food and drink sector, really. And beyond that, into textiles, tourism, services, and lots more. Going local has got to be the route to increasing the sustainability in all our lives and to making Scotland a more sustainable nation and contributing to our net zero targets. So thank you.
We have some time for a few questions. So I'm just going to have a quick look at what we've got here. Yeah, so there's a question here for Kate, actually, which is really specifically about the abattoir industry, but I think it's also about the kind of wider question of local food chains. And so the question really is, the abattoir industry in Scotland seems to be an issue for local smaller scale farms. There's so few of them now that it can add significant food miles. Does QMS have a role to play in increasing the number of local abattoirs? And I've got another question on local food chains, Kate. So if you want to take that one first of all, and then we'll take the second one and open it up to the panel a bit.
Yeah, so absolutely. We've lost so many small abattoirs. We've lost so many abattoirs in general, really, but there is a real lack of small local abattoirs that butchers and farmers can use themselves rather than the great big ones. I'm working across lots of different groups to try and increase that. The Prince's Countryside Fund are hugely involved in a campaign for small and local abattoirs. There's lots of other campaigns going on, and it definitely is something that we need to look at. There is absolutely no point in promoting local food if it needs to travel hundreds of miles to go through one of the processing factors. And that applies to other things as well. You know, milk on your doorstep. There's no point in a dairy farm in Dumfries and Galloway, for example, supplying local milk, which has to be transported to Edinburgh to be put in bottles. All these parts of the infrastructure are things that we've lost, and it's very, very important to get them back. And I think as a society, we need to think about them as being infrastructure. They shouldn't be there to make profits. They should be part of the infrastructure in the way that a harbour is for fishing boats. You know, you can't bring in fish without a harbour. So we need all those sort of processing links in the chain to be in place at a local level if we're going to make this work.
Thanks, Kate. I mean, it ties into this whole discussion about local food chains, I think. And, you know, we've obviously seen during the COVID lockdown periods that the demand for local food has actually increased as many farmers have stepped up and offered food locally and directly to consumers. But it would be quite a challenge to switch all of our food chains to those local shorter supply chains. I mean, how do you see that sector developing? How much capacity do you think it has to grow, and how might you know, other technologies such as the tower farming systems that you were talking about, Derek, you know, how might that tie into these more local supply chains?
Certainly the controlled environment systems, or vertical farms, you want to call it, they've got a place in production, not just for direct production, but they can be producing plantlets for existing infrastructure. I think that's the key about vertical farming, that it's not just you either grow it in that or you use traditional methods. It would sit within the whole portfolio of the thing. What it does allow you to do is it evens out the noise that climate change is causing. If you want to put it on a betting, that's your banker. You're getting an evens or a better odds on producing in that. You know you will produce, you know your bar of quality will be high, so you may actually want to go for your high premium crops in vertical farm-based systems. And remember, the controlled environment systems, you can grow insects in them as well. It's not just for crops. So what William was talking about earlier comes into that. But what I think is you'll see an increasing amount of mixed model farming, particularly if single farms or cooperatives want to get together and buy a vertical farm system that at some point will produce food and other points will produce plantlets that will be then taken out and grown outside or in their existing glass house systems. And that gives them a lot of security in their own supply chain. And so rather than, well, we don't know what Brexit's bringing, there may be tariffs on importing plantlets that they'll be growing. They potentially could be growing their own.
William, you were nodding at the mention of a mixed a mixed farming system, mixed supply chain. Do you see local supply chains as being part of the answer and the filling this protein gap and reducing waste?
Yeah, absolutely. There was so many things in there from what Kate and Eric were saying. So, just picking up in order, you know, that infrastructure question around abattoirs could also be applied to, for example, peas and beans. So we don't have freeze drying infrastructure in Scotland. We do, but it's limited in capacity and geographic coverage. So to increase the peas and beans, like we were talking about, you know, we need to look downstream at the infrastructure and start to think about what that looks like, how to maximise the value. And you could apply the same thinking to grain dryers as well. You know, there's maybe a low carbon renewable fuel story within both of those. As far as local loops go, for me, I can't close the loop unless it's locally. You know, if we're shipping a green bean from Kenya to Scotland for further processing, I can't technically close that loop. We can recover the value in Scotland, but how do we look after the soils and other things in the wider supply chain? So, I mean, the same could be applied to wastes. You know, 95% moisture, you don't want to be moving them about, and it's these options. It might not be re-entering the food chain, it might be anaerobic digestion to deal with wastes, depending on what the specific wastes and the local opportunity is, but there's certainly a story within that. And then looking to this, you know, the market pool question around local markets, just as an example of a development that we've seen in other places, is Sweden have put in place their school procurement systems have to source X amount of food from within X number of miles of the farm. So it's really the government's coming in at that stage and putting in place, you know, until the market catches up with what agriculture's doing, they'll pull these products through their systems and, you know, really take a wider approach to solving the problem. So very much, I think everybody is on the same page as far as all of these issues go.
And Kate, presumably you agree with this, but we've also got a challenge, do we not, that we lose some of the economies of scale which allow us to deliver affordable food to a large number of people if we go to very local supply chains. So, I mean, how do you see the supply chain mix looking as we go forward?
Yeah, and it's about a mix of everything, like you say. It's not about every single farmer using a small abattoir and selling direct to the public, because that, you know, there are lots of members of the public who don't want that, and there's lots of farmers who don't want to do that. So it's about making sure that the options are all there for the people who want to do it. Mm-hmm. I think there are far more farmers in the country who would much prefer to sell direct to the public or in a much shorter supply chain if they could. But there's also still always going to be a place for supermarkets. There's going to be a place for consistency and people who just want to get some meat that they know has been well brought up and well raised and looked after. They don't necessarily need to know the actual farm that it's coming from. So there is a place for all these parts. But I think there's definitely been a shift to local. I think it was happening anyway. I think COVID has hugely accelerated it, and we can't develop that any further without the local infrastructure in place. It's probably got as far as it can get, I would say.
Thank you. Derek, just switching back to kind of the new technology and the tower farming and so on. I mean, who do you think is going to be the early adopters of this? And in fact, not only the early adopters, what might a more mature industry start to look like? I mean, are we going to see this as something that farmers are getting into, or is this going to bring in new operators? Is it going to be supermarkets, processors, or new disruptors? How's this going to play out, do you think?
All of the above, I would say at the moment, to be honest, Clive. So we've got the first commercial ones going in Scotland. It's Vertigrow in Aberdeenshire. I think they're backed by Brewdog, to be honest. But the companies I'm working with, for a lot of them, it's for supplying. A lot of them are supplying food into large urbanised areas, and you certainly I suspect we'll see one in Glasgow sooner than later, to be honest. The thing is, because you've got the environment, you could be repurposing old buildings and refitting them in for that production system. So old warehouses that we see getting pulled down, I'm just thinking a minute, with Debenhams collapsing, you've got huge areas that potentially we might be putting vertical farms into. Seems like a stupid idea when you say it now, but actually going forward, maybe not so crazy. Mm-hmm. Or I mean, they could be both commercial and social. So the one thing that had crossed my mind was actually, if we're building new hospitals, why don't we have a vertical farm right next to it? So you don't have air miles at all on your food. You've got yards or meters. And actually, because it's plants are growing in there, they often need heat for energy. And if you can add more CO2, what you do is scrub the flue gas, and you can cycle that back into your production system. So you're reducing energy costs, but with more CO2, you're producing even better. So there's loads of ways it can be done. I do think certainly to bring it back to Scotland and the farming community, I think a cooperative approach is probably the way they'll go forward on it, because you can then use it as a mixed model system, as I said before. So you might want to be producing some really nice high-end veg, micro veg, fruit even in the winter, whereas in the springtime or early on, you could be producing plantlets that are ready to go out and get planted outside. So your downtime should be virtually nothing.
So you could see potential for farmers to come together, create cooperatives in order to produce young plant, go out into systems that are on farm.
Absolutely. I find a lot of the people that are coming into this now are coming in with I don't want to buy a toy that's going to be sitting idle for any of the time. And that's the way to maximize your use. Of course, you got ones that it may not be food. Again, as I'd mentioned to someone on the chat thing, you could be growing crops that are used to produce pharmaceuticals.
And William, a question about the protein gap and the different protein strategies that are developing around the world. And I think what you were flagging is that the discussion here in Scotland is still at its early stages, if I understand it correctly. And how do you see that strategy developing? I'm obviously conscious that we're also at a point in time when agricultural policy itself is a little bit uncertain, and it strikes me that there's potentially an opportunity there for a discussion that's involving agricultural policy, environmental policy, and it seems as though it needs a discussion about a protein strategy as well. How do you see that playing out?
So the strategies I showed you earlier, we were talking about downstream infrastructure earlier on. The French strategy and the Manitoba strategy specifically look to, I mean, the thing for me, we talk about agriculture, but a lot of the impact that's associated with that blanket term is actually off farm as well. I mean, that's the thing with the strategies, they take a whole system approach. So they're not just looking at, the management on farm, they're actually looking at the nutrient leakages right the way across the system and trying to put in place, policy, but also technological innovations to look that back in. Going back to the original, Germany was the first, I think. It was Germany, France, the EU, and then Netherlands. Germany, France, and the Netherlands are all just about to publish new strategies. The German one was focused very much on getting genetically modified soy out of their domestic supply chains. For them, genetically modified, GMO-free means it's not in the supply chain at all. So the drivers change. For France, it was very much, we've got a great industry, but we're not actually capitalising on it. How does the government put that in place? And then each of them learn from the one before. And Scotland's in a great position now to learn from them all, to look across them, to think about, none of them speak to, Manitoba speaks to livestock, none of them speak to aquaculture. So it's starting to look at not just, we're very good at finding opportunities within sectors, but with the bioeconomy, it's quite often between sectors that these kind of, if you're talking about nitrogen management, it might not be the sink, you might be the source and not the sink. You might need to talk to somebody else. So it recognises that there's amazing work going on within Scotland, right across research through industry and citizen scientists as well. But quite often we work in isolation. I've been on this for 2 years, and every time I come to one of these meetings, I'll meet somebody new that I wasn't really aware of it. Grass refining. It turns out everybody in Europe's been doing this for a while, and they're at scale. And Kate can maybe speak to, or Derek can probably speak to whether that's ongoing in the UK or what stage that's at, but these kind of learnings from other countries within that strategic context are of interest. Within Scotland, we held 2 events recently to really start the conversation, to highlight, following the list of commonalities between them, stakeholder engagement. It's not about us telling agriculture or aquaculture or anybody, you need to cut your emissions by 20%. You've got till now. It's saying, we recognise that you guys have done great work. We recognise that we all collectively need to get to what good looks like. How do we manage the conversations from here to there? How do we accelerate that progress? It's about government, legislator, academic, industry, farmer access, and getting those conversations much shorter. So this is really the start of a conversation to form expert groups to start to discuss what would be in the protein strategy. And it's recognised Scotland's geography is very different, its regions are very different. And I think that kind of granularity in the cooperative farmers is where we really need to get to enable my work, but also to enable this conversation around Scotland's sustainable food to move forward. I mean, Scotland's amazing at what we're doing. We always have been. We've made amazing progress. We're in a position to lead the global platform as always. It's just keeping the momentum going at this stage. So we don't have a formal strategy at the moment. There is interest in the co-benefits that we could deliver, and we're currently working to understand what specifically that looks like with the stakeholders such as yourself.
So you mentioned there Scotland's unique landscape and unique resource mix that we have, and that ties into a question that we have here, which is really directed primarily to Kate, but to all the panelists, as to how you see upland grasslands looking in a generation's time. So we're accepting all these all this uniqueness that Scotland's got, but undoubtedly we're still going to have to change the way that we operate. How might Scotland's uplands look like? Not only in terms of biodiversity, but I suppose also in terms of the livestock systems that are there or not there, and the people. Kate, do you want to take that slightly broad question?
I think really we've forgotten an awful lot over the past, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years. Ever since the Second World War, I suppose, the policy has driven agriculture towards producing more. And farmers are very good at following policy. They're very good at adapting to make as much of a living as they can, depending on the policy environment. So the policy is now obviously changing, and that's good. That's fantastic. And you won't find a farmer out there who doesn't love the nature that they live in, who doesn't know all the names of the trees and the birds that are on their farm, who doesn't know where the small mammals are and the birds' nests. Everybody who works in the countryside, it's part of you. You can't, you don't, people have an image that farmers don't care, but farmers are absolutely soaked in that sort of thing. But they have followed policy. So as the policy is changing, I think we'll go back to the way things possibly used to be. So more native breeds of cattle and sheep who are more used to living outside on the hills and the uplands instead of having to be in sheds and fed on grain and things. There will, I would imagine, with the tree planting figures, that we're going to have to go back to having more trees in Scotland. And I wouldn't like to see that as great big blocks of conifers that have taken over whole farms. What we need to go back to is integrating trees and livestock so that we've got both on farms. They're brilliant trees as shelter belts. They're great for all sorts of things on farms, and everybody loves trees, and we need to find ways to integrate them all and stop seeing it as a fight between livestock and trees or livestock and other land uses. We need to be thinking about how we can integrate everything. So you're getting down to even things like flood prevention and access to the countryside. We need to find ways at regional levels to integrate all these things together and stop making it a competition.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else would like to contribute? We've got a couple of minutes just quickly on what the Scottish uplands might look like. Presumably, William, the peas and beans are being planted on the lowland, are they?
Yeah, I mean, I think forestry definitely does have its place, but again, you get into, if you're farming trees for climate change, you're looking to sequester, and the mix of trees changes. So again, we need to look at the downstream infrastructure to pick these things up. So I need forestry as a part. You mentioned it yourself. There's no silver bullet. We need a mix, a suite of measures to really address this. But I think we need to be careful around what that forestry looks like. Seaweed sequesters 200 times the carbon dioxide of a tree. Do we need to look at that? I had to skip past it, but there was a robot tree in my presentation. So people have built a robot tree using microalgae that captures CO2 in urban environments. So there's potential to look to marginal land and other options before we start losing farmland and rural communities and you know, farms and everything else?
Well, look, I think we're now 1 minute to 2 o'clock, so I should really just draw this to a close now. I mean, it strikes me that we've got a massive challenge ahead, but it also feels to me that there are lots of possible answers and solutions to some of these challenges that we're facing. But it also feels that there's a big discussion, a big debate, a lot of dots to be joined between all the different voices and all the different potential solutions that there are, and that we're very much at the start of that journey. And I guess it's about trying to find a way to engage all these different parts, the new technology, the management of waste, the challenge of finding enough protein to feed everyone, and the challenge to maintain our existing livestock systems, to look after our uplands, and also to look after the people that live in many of our remote areas. But I have to say, I come out of the conversation feeling optimistic, optimistic for the future, and food particularly, and for us in Scotland. So I'd just like to thank our panelists very much for speaking to us today. Derek Stewart from Hutton, William Clark from Zero Waste, and Kate Rowell from QMS. And I would like to thank you, the participants, for joining us today, and my colleagues for working hard in the background, keeping the slides moving and keeping the audio and video right. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks very much.